earth-centered African spiritual traditions are becoming just as capitalistic as the church. Don't get me wrong. We have a long way to go before we are as capitalistic and exploitative as the black church. We have a long way to go, but we are catching up fast. We are catching up fast. And the purpose of this lesson, this conversation today, is I want to ask a question. Brothers and sisters, today's lesson is going to be on spiritual capitalism. Spiritual capitalism. Spiritual capitalism. Now, we all know the black church has a history and legacy of exploiting people financially for the right to serve God. We know this. We know this. The black church has at least a modern history of capitalist exploitation of black people who would like to participate in their congregational services towards the Most High God. Some churches require your tax return. Some churches require your pay stubs. Some churches dictate how much money you must give. And if you cannot meet the financial obligations, you will be turned away. You will be turned away. In fact, the greatest criticism of the black church is this concept of having to pay before you can praise, having to pay before you can pray. How do you put a price on prayer? How do you put a price on worship? How do you put a price on building a relationship with Supreme God? Obviously, the black church has found a way. The white church has also found a way to exploit spirituality for fortune. But we're not talking about the white church. We're talking about the black church that has clearly found a way to exploit people's desire to achieve supreme oneness with the Almighty. They have found a way to exploit that desire into a financial payday. Nowhere in the Bible does it justify this behavior. In fact, the megachurch itself, the modern phenomenon of the megachurch itself, speaks directly to the black church as being an engine of capitalism and greed. The black church is an engine of capitalism and greed. There is no denying that. In the megachurch era, there is no denying the fact that the black church is an engine of capitalism and greed. All that money, no banks. All that money, no schools. All that money, no supermarkets. All that money, no hospitals. All that money, no manufacturing system. All that money, no distribution network. All that money, no community security system. All that money, no entrepreneurial investment system. How can that be? All the money goes into the white bank uses black people's money to finance gentrification. I said the white bank uses black people's money to finance gentrification. I said the white bank uses black people's money to finance gentrification. But I'm not here today to talk about the white bank. I'm not here today to talk about religious capitalism. I'm here to talk about spiritual capitalism. I'm not here today to talk about religious capitalism. I'm here to talk about spiritual capitalism. I'm not here today to talk about religious capitalism. I'm here today to talk about spiritual capitalism. In other words, I want to talk about the African spiritual, traditional, earth-centered spiritual systems. Let's talk about the African earth-centered traditions. Some people ain't going to like what I have to say. Some people are not going to like what I have to say. Some people are not going to like what I have to say. African traditional spiritual systems, or traditional African spiritual systems, earth-centered African spiritual traditions are becoming just as capitalistic as the church. Don't get me wrong. We have a long way to go before we are as capitalistic and exploitative as the black church. We have a long way to go, but we are catching up fast. We are catching up fast. And the purpose of this lesson, this conversation today, is I want to ask a question. to all of us who practice traditional African spiritual systems. I don't care if you are Ifa, as am I. I don't care if you are Dogon, Akan, Kemet, Santeria, Lukumi, Palo. It don't matter. If you practice traditional African spirituality, we have to ask ourselves, is traditional African spirituality in the United States in particular, but in the Western world in general, is traditional African spirituality being hijacked by a capitalistic and exploitative mode of financial greed? Now, for me, someone in my position, I can afford to pay for the Defa. I can afford to pay for the divinations. I can afford to pay for the initiations. I can afford to pay for the birthing, the head cleanings, the various rituals and activities. I can afford to pay for that. A lot of us can't. In particular, I'm talking about single mothers and their children, because they are the most vulnerable segment of the African population in the Western Hemisphere. In the Western Hemisphere. Spiritual capitalism. I've been studying the Holy Odu Ifa. I've been looking at the Holy Odu Ifa, which is my personal sacred text. But I want my brothers and sisters in the Akan to study your sacred text. I want my brothers and sisters in Kemet to study your sacred text. I want my brothers and sisters in Dogon to study your sacred text. I want the Lukumi and the Palo and the Voodoo and the Santeria brothers and sisters to study your sacred text. And my question is real simple. Can somebody show me where in the canon of traditional African spiritual literature, from East Africa to West Africa, from Central Africa to South Africa, can someone show me somewhere within this vast oral and written tradition of African spirituality where it says we are supposed to charge money for every service that is offered to an individual or a community? Can someone show me that? I am an Awo. I'm studying to become a Babalawo. I've been initiated. And when I get to the point where I'm able to offer spiritual service to my people, I plan to do it in a completely different way. I don't plan to charge people money. I plan to charge them service. Service. You need to receive this Orisha. You need to receive this Netter. You need to be initiated with these Obusum, these Loa. You need a head rogation, an initiation, a sacrifice, an offering. You're going to do it. You're going to pay for it in service. Go teach those children African language for a month. That will cover the cost of your ritual. We have a couple elders who are not being properly cared for. Go properly care for those elders for 6 months. That will cover your initiation. Why can't we go to a service-oriented system of paying for traditional African services, rituals, and initiations? Why can't we go to service? Why are we using the same medium of financial exchange? Why are we using a Eurocentric, cash-based system which comes out of European capitalism? Why do we have to use that in order to help people progress on their spiritual journey? If you need money in order to grow spiritually, if you need money in order to access higher levels of spiritual reality, if everything has to be paid in money, how are African traditional spiritual systems any different than the Black church? If a single mother on fixed income needs to have a certain set of rituals or sacrifices, initiations done for her or her children to guarantee a blessing or avoid a tragedy, if there's something coming up in her life that requires a certain amount of sacrifice, but she can't afford it, does that mean we abandon her? What if one of her children, what if all her children, what if everybody in the family has to participate in a particular initiation or offering to spirit, but they can't afford your fees? What happens then? Don't get me wrong. Babalawos, Iyanifas, priests and priestesses of any African tradition should be compensated. It's hard work to help someone advance on the spiritual path. It is spiritually draining to spend a whole day offering divinations to people. I understand this. I understand. But why did you get initiated if you did not choose to walk this path for the sake of service to the community? Don't get me wrong. I don't know any Babalawos who are rich. As I said, we're not the equivalent of the church by far. I don't know Babalawos who are rich, but at the same time, I know a lot of black people who can't afford to pay for the services. Are we not asking too much money? Even if you say there's no way to do this without financial exchange, and I totally disagree. I totally disagree. I believe we can go to a service-based system to compensate Babalawos, Iyanifas, priests and priestesses of other traditions. I believe we can go to a service-based system to compensate them for their works. I totally disagree with any brethren. I totally disagree with any brethren who says we can only do this through European financial exchange. I completely reject that. But even if you are of that opinion, can we at least reduce the fees? Can we at least reduce the fees? Or could we come up with a universal fee schedule so it's universal? How about that? So no matter what Babalawo you go, what priest you go to, what Santero you go to, what Iyanifa you go to, it's the same price across the universe, or at least in the Western Hemisphere. How about that? But we have to do something because there's a lot of black people who want to walk the path of traditional African spirituality, and many of them are being pushed back to the church, pushed back to the temple, pushed back to the masjid, pushed back to the kingdom hall because they cannot afford to get started in this tradition. And no one is going to tell me that Olodumare. No one's going to tell me that Chukwu. No one's going to tell me that Nyame. No one's going to tell me that Amin Ra. No one's going to tell me by whatever name we refer to the great I am. No one is going to convince me that God intended traditional African spirituality to be a system of worship and spiritual development that you can only access if you can afford it. As long as traditional African spirituality, the access of traditional African spirituality is contingent on your ability to pay high fees, thousands of dollars in many cases, hundreds of dollars in many cases, over and over again. No one's going to convince me that God intended you to have to pay tens of thousands of dollars in order to access the highest levels of spiritual growth. You're not going to tell me that. You are not going to tell me that. You are not going to tell me that. How can poor people participate in our tradition? That's the question I'm asking you. My Kamites, fees can be high in your tradition. Dogon, Akan, Ifa, Voodoo, Palo, Santeria, Lukumi. The fees are excessive. I don't care if you are angry. The fees are excessive. I'm okay. I can pay it. Other so-called middle-class blacks can pay it. Poor Africans can't afford that. So how are they able to barter for what they need to fulfill their spiritual destiny? So you mean to tell me a poor person doesn't have a right to have a particular netter or orisha or loa birthed into their life? They don't have a right to get a divination to find out what they need to do to straighten out their spiritual affairs. They don't have a right to be properly initiated into the house of their guardian angel. Is that what we're saying? I exist because God made me. I am. I don't exist in relation to everything else or anything else. I exist because God made me. I am. God does not exist in relation to anything else. God is. That's why the ancient Kemites said, I am. I am has nothing to do with who you are. I am has nothing to do with what is. I am has nothing to do with what was. I am has nothing to do with what will be. I am that I am because I am. That's it. That's the spirit.